Great, guys. So we're going to learn section 2.3 today. Tomorrow and Wednesday, we're gonna start proofs. But they're algebra proofs at first. We do a few on Tuesday or on Wednesday that are geometry proofs. And then next week, I believe on Monday, you'll have a practice quiz, and on Tuesday, you'll have a quiz on chapter 2, just so you're aware of that. Okay, so what we're gonna do today, in the very first lesson of this chapter, we talked about something called inductive reasoning. And with that was where you looked at a pattern of examples and you tried to come up with the next thing in, a series of numbers. With deductive reasoning, you're going to use like a fact or a rule, or today we're going to learn 2 laws that you use to reach a logical conclusion, okay? So one of the things that we need to do today is be able to determine if something is an example or if something is an actual rule, okay? So I'll try to give you guys an example. When my kids were in high school, I had one child who was always running late, which made me late. So often I would pull into the teachers have to be here at 7:30, and I brought my kids to school when they were younger. So it seemed like every day I was here at like 7:31 or 7:32. I'd never get here by 7:30. So somebody could have made an inductive reasoning that Mrs. Botten is always late. And honestly, I was always a minute or 2 late. With deductive reasoning, there would be a rule or something like that I would get in trouble for. Or like if Mrs. Botten is late every day, her pay would get deducted for that time. Something like that, okay? So not just looking at is she always late, but what happens if you're always late, okay? So one of the types of questions that you're gonna have today is they're gonna give you a scenario and you have to decide, would I use inductive reasoning or would I use deductive reasoning? So with deductive, you want to think about, is there a law? Is there a rule? Is there something you could say for sure? So this says every time Lauren has a healthy meal before her run, she is able to run farther than her sister who does not like healthy meals. Lauren has eaten a healthy meal, so she concludes that she will run farther than her sister, okay? This says nothing about how in shape either of the girls are. It doesn't say anything about how often they run, anything like that. I think we all could agree if you're going to run and you eat healthy, it's better for you, right? It's going to make your run a little bit easier. But there's not like a law that says if you eat healthy, then you can run farther than your sister, correct? So this one would just be inductive reasoning. Just because there's no actual rule that says that, okay? Now if you look down here, it says, if John is late making his car insurance payment, he will be assessed a late fee of $50. John's payment is late this month, so he concludes that he will be assessed a late fee of $50. Is there some type of rule in this one? There is, right? And that is the case with different payments. If you are late, you do get a late fee. So this one is deductive, okay? So inductive if there is no rule, deductive if there is a rule, okay? Now we are going to learn 2 laws today. So we're going to be using deductive reasoning. And the 2 laws, again, you're going to kind of be like, why are we learning this in math? But remember, we're trying to learn logic skills to help us in proofs and with different problem solving skills in the future. So the first law that there is called Law of Detachment. And first of all, when you see P, this arrow means implies Q. That means that that should be an if-then statement, okay? The second thing is going to be a partial statement, and this has to refer back to the if part of the sentence. And then this has to refer back to the ending part of that sentence, okay? So in Law of Detachment, you have one if-then statement and then two partial statements, okay? So here's an example. It says, if you are 16 years old, so that would be your P, then you can get your license. Now notice there are two partial statements, which what I mean by that is it's not an if-then form, okay? This one says, Maddie is 16 years old. This has to refer back to the beginning. And what they'll do a lot of times, if this is just a generic, like if you are 16 years old, they'll name the person that's 16 years old. And then the last part has to refer back to the then part of that statement. And do you see that this does refer back to being 16 years old? This refers back to getting your license, okay? So that is Law of Detachment. Now, in Law of Syllogism, at the beginning, you still have an if-then statement, okay? And then what happens is you have two more if-then statements. One thing I didn't mention with Law of Detachment, and this is the case with both laws, if your first sentence is not an if-then form, you have to put it in if-then form for either case, okay? Then with Law of Syllogism, your last two should be an if-then form. If they're not, it's not Law of Syllogism, okay? Now, with Law of Syllogism, the ending of this statement and the beginning of that statement are going to be very, very similar, talking about the same thing. So you cross those out and you say, if this, then this. That's what your final would be. So these two have to be talking about the same thing. So if I look at my example down here, it says, if it is winter, then it will snow. Here's the second part of the first statement. If it will snow, now are these two saying the same thing? Right? They are. So you cross that out, and your final thing is going to be, if it is winter, then the roads get slippery. Even if that statement doesn't make sense, we don't care about that. What we care about is the ending of this and the beginning of that the same? If they are, we cross it out and we say, if this, then that. Okay? All right, so let's go to this page. So we're gonna deal just with Law of Detachment at first. And again, just a reminder, first statement has to be an if-then form. If it's not, you put it in if-then form. And it's for either law, they have to be that. Okay, so you're gonna have this statement that either is in if-then form or you're gonna put it in if-then form. Then what happens is the second partial statement has to refer back to the beginning. The third statement has to refer back to the end. Okay, so if we look down here, they have an example for us. If a car is out of gas, then it will not start. Sarah's car is out of gas. Isn't this talking about that, right? And then the conclusion is Sarah's car will not start. Now, one thing that I did not say is these two can't be in the opposite order, okay? The second one has to refer back to the first, third one has to refer back to the second, okay? All right, now if we look at this example, I will tell you first of all, when you guys are doing this, today it's gonna say explain your reasoning, and you do not have to do that at all today, okay? This example is harder because it has so many words. It's a little bit harder than what some of them are. So it says, if two angles form a linear pair, that's my P, then their non-common sides are opposite rays. This is talking about two angles that form a linear pair. So it is talking about the beginning. Is this talking about opposite rays? It is, correct? Do you guys get that? This is referring back to the beginning. This is referring back to the second part. So what we would say there is that this is valid. Okay? So all you're saying on this is valid if it is, invalid if it's not. Right? Now let's go and look at this one. If Micah goes to the beach, then she will wear sunscreen. Micah is wearing sunscreen. Micah is at the beach. Is that correct? Does this talk about going to the beach? No. So do you get, isn't this talking about the end? And that's not how we want it. So we just say invalid. The second thing has to talk about the first part of the sentence, okay? This says if 3 points are non-collinear, they determine a plane. And this right here, this second statement, is it talking about points being non-collinear, or is the last statement talking about that? The last, right? This is talking about 3 points determining a plane. So is that valid? No. Do you guys get that? Okay. You want the second thing to talk about the first part of that sentence. Okay? It says, if a student turns in a permission slip, then the student can go on the field trip. And then it says, Philippe turned in his permission slip, and then it says Philippe can go on the field trip. Is that correct? Yes. So we just say valid. Questions on that at all? Okay. Now let's go here, and we're going to review again what Law of Syllogism is. With Law of Syllogism, again, guys, if the first thing is not in if-then form, you have to put it in if-then form. First statement, sometimes you'll have to write in if-then form. First statement has to be in if-then form. Now again, if you guys remember what Law of Syllogism was, the ending of this and the beginning of that have to be the same, and we cross those out. And then you say if P, then R. Okay? So here's an example of this one. If you get a job, then you will earn money. If you earn money, then you will buy a car. So the ending of this and the beginning of that are the same. So we cross those out. And this is important too, guys. You have to put this part first and then this part second. Okay? All right. So let's go and do a couple questions with this. So these questions that have an A or B, an A and B like this, one of these is going to be valid, one's going to be invalid, and you, at no point today do you have to explain your reasoning, okay? So what do you guys think? If you are an actor, then you enjoy musicals. If you enjoy musicals, so remember these two are getting crossed out. Which one is valid, A or B? B, correct? It should say, if you are an actor, then you enjoy theater productions. So this one is valid, and then that would just mean this one is invalid. So when you have an A or a B like that, one is valid, one is invalid. Okay. Now let's go down here. Same thing. It says, if you do not get enough sleep, then you will be tired. If you are tired, then you will not do well on the test. Is A or B the correct one? If you do not get enough sleep, A or B? B, right? Then you will not do well on this test. So the first one is invalid, second one is valid. All right. Now, let's go to this page right here. And we're gonna use Law of Syllogism to draw a valid conclusion if possible. Now, this is something weird that your book does. If you can't draw a conclusion on this, they have you write no valid conclusion. And instead of that today, if it's not gonna work, I want you to just write invalid whenever it's not going to work. So don't worry about, do I have to write invalid or no valid conclusion? Just always write invalid and don't worry about explaining your reasoning. So when you guys get a Law of Syllogism one, the first two, this time you're only given the first two, and you have to see, can you write a third one? If you can, you write it. If you can't, you write invalid. So let's look there here. Remember, the ending of this and the beginning of that have to be very similar. And are they? They are, right? So then you'd cross these out and you'd write what's left. So your conclusion would be, if a hurricane is category 5, then trees, shrubs, and signs are blowing down. So if you can write a valid conclusion, you write it. If you can't, then you just write invalid. Okay? Now we're checking for Law of Syllogism. In Law of Syllogism, your second one has to be an if-then form. You never have to change it. It has to be an if-then form. This one is not, so that just means this is invalid. Okay? The second in Law of Syllogism has to be an if-then form. Then if we go down to C, so what they'll do sometimes to confuse you is they'll give you the top line won't be an if-then form. Regardless what law you're looking at, that top one has to be an if-then form. So what I'm gonna do is do that first. I'm gonna write that top one in if-then form right above it. So I'm gonna say, if you are a ballet dancer, then you like classical music. So I just took that first sentence and I wrote it in if-then form, okay? Now we have to see, is this law of syllogism? So with law of syllogism, remember that the ending of this and the beginning of the second have to be talking about the same thing, and they are. So then what we would do is just get rid of those and write the if part from the above and then the then part from here. Don't ever worry about like, well, I don't know that that's actually true. We don't care about if that resulting one is true or not. We just, if it's law of syllogism, we have to write it. Then let's look at this one. Does this look right? Is the ending of this and the beginning of that talking about the same thing? No. So then we just write invalid. Okay. All right, so let's go to our last page. And this is where they're putting the two together, and you have to determine, first of all, can we write a valid conclusion? And if we do, we do. And then we have to say what law it is. If you can't write a valid conclusion, then you just say invalid, okay? So remember law of detachment, the first thing has to be an if-then form. This goes back to the beginning. This goes back to the end. Law of syllogism, also that first one has to be an if-then form. If it's not, write it. And then these Q's cancel, and you say if P, then R. So if we can write one, we do. And then we have to say what law it is. If we can't, we're just gonna write invalid again. So if they say to write no valid conclusion, don't worry about that, just write invalid. Okay, so when you guys look at this one, the first one's in if-then form. There really should be a then right here, but it is. Now, do you guys get this is a partial statement? It's not an if-then form. So that tells you this can't be law of syllogism. It can only be law of detachment. With law of detachment, this has to refer back to the beginning, which it does. So what would our conclusion be then? Sarah can take her driver's test, yes. So Sarah can take her driver's test. Okay, and then you have to say which law. And here's what I'm gonna have you guys do. You can do, this one was detachment. So for detachment, you can just write detach. If it's syllogism, you can just do SYLL. Okay, so you'll see one like that in a second. Okay, this is an if-then form, this is an if-then form. What does that tell us to look for? Syllogism, right? And with syllogism, the ending of this and the beginning of this has to be the same, which it is, correct? So this is law of syllogism, okay? And then what I'm gonna write is if, and remember too, you can use the number angle. I always do an angle apostrophe S. Are complementary, if you want to just do COMP, then both of the angles are acute. And that was law of syllogism, and you do have to say what law you used. So for, if you wanna abbreviate syllogism, you can just go SYLL. Okay, now let's look here. Which one do you guys think we should look at if this is an if-then form, but that one's not? Detachment. Does this refer back to the beginning? It doesn't, right? Doesn't it actually refer back to the end? So what do we write? Invalid. And when it's invalid, you guys, you don't write a law because it wasn't one that worked, so there really wasn't a law that we used. So when it's invalid, that's all you write. This one has two if-thens, so you think of syllogism, okay? Now, is the ending of this and the beginning of that talking about the same? No. Isn't it these two that are the same? And that isn't what we want. So it's just invalid. And when it's invalid, we don't worry about putting the law. Okay? Now, this last one, regardless what your type of law you're using, the first thing has to be an if-then form. So we're gonna cut this right here. We're gonna say, if two angles are vertical, something like that, then they are congruent. And you can use the symbol for congruent if you want to, and equals with a squiggly. Okay, so I just rewrote this. Now, because that second thing is just one statement, a partial statement, that means we're gonna look at detachment. And in detachment, this has to talk about that, does it? Doesn't that talk about them being congruent? So it's actually talking about the end. So what do we write then? If it's not talking about the first, then it's invalid, okay? So this is just going to be invalid. Okay, now, your assignment is this right here. Don't worry about explaining your reasoning. And if you ever have the first statement not in if-then form, like it says here, number 18 is like that, the first statement you would write in if-then form, okay? So if that first statement is not in if-then form, you'd have to rewrite it. Did you guys think it was hard today? You guys are so quiet today.